The United States is putting Russia's President Vladimir Putin on notice as a top U.S. commander compares Russia's recent moves to Nazi Germany. The Defense Secretary Ash Carter says the U.S. will send hundreds of tanks and other equipment to several of our NATO allies, including former Soviet states in Eastern Europe. It's a show of military might meant to match Russia's war games. The Defense Secretary says the U.S. will also help equip NATO's so-called Rapid Response Force. That's a team to defend our allies from any Russian threat. This comes after economic punishments failed to force Russian troops out of eastern Ukraine, or as President Putin once called it, the new Russia. Putin's already taken over the Crimean Peninsula. He denies sending Russian troops into Ukraine, but he also says he wants to protect Russian speakers in Ukraine. Sound familiar from your history class? That's the same reason the Nazis gave when they moved into Czechoslovakia and took over the German-speaking regions there. The eerie similarities are not lost on our military leaders. The lieutenant general who oversees America's nuclear stockpile points out the last time we saw a nation make moves like Putin's, it eventually led to an all-out world war. Jennifer Griffin, live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, how seriously is the Pentagon taking the Putin threat?
Well, John, Lieutenant General Stephen Wilson, America's top U.S. nuclear commander, says he has never seen so much power concentrated in one man's hands in Russia. Quote, some of the actions by Russia recently we haven't seen since the 1930s, when whole countries were annexed and borders were changed by decree. Defense Secretary Ash Carter visited the USS San Antonio in Estonia today to calm the nerves of NATO's Baltic members. He announced the U.S. will send a brigade's worth of heavy weapons, tanks, artillery, and fighting vehicles to Eastern Europe.
You lost your independence once before. With NATO, you will never lose it again. That's because the United States and the rest of the NATO alliance are absolutely committed to defending the territorial integrity of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
His visit comes days after Russian fighter jets buzzed the USS San Antonio during NATO-led military exercises in the Baltic Sea as Putin announced plans to add 40 intercontinental ballistic missiles to his arsenal, John.
So what's the Pentagon doing to protect the U.S. against the Russian missile threat?
Well, the Pentagon is increasingly worried about Russia's advanced cruise missiles, which can evade traditional radar and are launched from the sea.
In order to stop these things, the reaction time is very short, and it's as much a problem of detecting them as it is launching some kind of interceptor to go get them. And so right now we don't just have all that much capability to even see these things coming, let alone kill them.
In fact, the Pentagon has requested urgent funding for a cruise missile defense shield to protect U.S. cities using National Guard F-16 fighter jets to spot and shoot down these low-flying radar-evading missiles, something Congress may not want to budget for at this point in time. John.
Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon. Thanks, Jennifer. Let's bring in Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former National Security Council staff member. He is now president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Ambassador, this comparison to what happened before World War II with Germany's invasion of Poland, how apt is that comparison with what the Russians are doing now?
Well, the aptness is in what the report said, which is the idea that Russia should have the right to protect any Russian-speaking people no matter where they are. That is the kind of language that we heard in the 1930s. At the same time, the kind of actions we've seen so far, while deeply worrying and in some ways deeply threatening, aren't at the par of what we saw in 1938 or 39, nor do we see the kind of militarization of the entire Russian society like we saw with the Nazi Germany in the 30s.
Does that mean you think that Putin is bluffing?
No, I think he's trying to establish himself as the big guy on the block. He will push as far as he can. He will continue to try to destabilize Ukraine and, if possible, other states that used to be part of the Soviet Union, like Moldova and Georgia. But I think the counter moves we're seeing from the United States and from NATO give me confidence that he won't push all the way into NATO territory. That really is a red line, not just for us, but we're clearly communicating to him that it is a red line for him.
So he is pushing, we're pushing back, NATO and the United States, with that brigade's worth of heavy weaponry that Jennifer Griffin described. Does that ratchet up the tensions, or does it ensure that there will not be a hot war in that part of the world?
Well, I think the message here is that the United States and the NATO allies are prepared to do what is necessary to defend their allies, the NATO allies in Eastern Europe. And Vladimir Putin better take notice of this. In that sense, it tends to ratchet the pressure down. What I'm more worried about is not the kind of deployment we're seeing by U.S. forces. What I'm worried about is this buzzing of ships and the wingtip to wingtip flying of Russian aircraft with our aircraft, the military flying all over the place with their transponders off so civilian radar can't see them. And I'm worried about the possibility of an accident which then can escalate in ways that nobody wants but still will happen.
Because tensions are so high and because there is so much military equipment concentrated in that part of the world right now?
Yeah, you know, for the first time really in 25 years, you've seen the remilitarization of relations between the West and Russia, where the language we're talking about is all about, it's about tanks, it's about troops, it's about snap maneuvering, it's about flying airplanes all over the place, and it's about nuclear weapons. We haven't seen that kind of rhetoric for a long time, and we're ratcheting up in that sense on both sides. I think in our case, justifiably so, in order to protect our allies. But it is creating a situation where if the only language we're using is that of military force, the possibility exists that an accident occurs and things escalate. So it's a deeply worrying trend in the relationship.
Does the hotline to the Kremlin still exist?
It does, so we're able to talk to the Kremlin and through the hotline, but we don't really have a dialogue. We certainly don't have a dialogue on the military side, which I would be in favor of. We had it in the Cold War, military to military talks. We had a whole series of agreements to avoid accidental maneuvering, to stabilize the confrontation, not to end it, or certainly not to give in, but to find a way to deal with each other on the military level to avoid the possibility of a war that no one wants.
Ivo Daalder, thank you.
My pleasure.